Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening for Designing Memory. I'm Marguerite Winter, Manager of Public Programs and Partnerships here at the Chicago Architecture Biennial. Tonight's program is part of CAB's new model for free year-round programming. This model allows our organization to share thinking that goes into creating a biennial and to engage with critical issues facing the architecture field and beyond on an ongoing basis. I'm honored to welcome Jha D Williams, Senior Associate and Co-Director at Mass Design Group, and Dr. Patricia Nguyen, Artist and Memorial Designer for the Chicago Torture Justice Memorial Project, to speak about how projects they are involved with center the voices of survivors and work to memorize the past while acknowledging the present. Jha D Williams is a Senior Associate and Co-Director of the Public Memory and Memorials Lab at Mass Design Group. As a project manager, she has contributed to the Gun Violence Memorial Project, Franklin Park Action Plan, and Kendall School Division II Memorial. Outside of architecture, Jha D is a spoken word artist and event producer focused on narratives of LGBTQ+ communities of color. Patricia Nguyen is PhD, is an assistant professor in Asian American Studies and Council for Race and Ethnic Studies at Northwestern University, where she also earned her PhD in performance studies. Her research and performance work examines state violence, the prison industrial complex, critical refugee studies, political economy, forced migration, intergenerational trauma, torture, and nation building in the United States and Vietnam. Community-based praxis and experimentation is a fundamental ethos of her work as an artist and scholar committed to abolition. She has published work in Women's Studies Quarterly, Harvard Kennedy School's Asian American Policy Review, and Women Performance, as well as The Phenomenalist. In recent news, Dr. Nguyen is an award-winning memorial designer for the Chicago Torture Justice Memorial Project, the first monument in the United States to honor survivors of police violence. For tonight's program, our speakers will present on projects that they're involved in, followed by an open dialogue between the two. Following the conversation, I will return for the Q&A portion of the program for audience questions. Please use the Q&A function throughout our conversation to submit questions. Enjoy.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Marguerite, and to the larger CAB community for having me here tonight. It certainly feels good to be able to share a little bit more about the work that I have been doing since we were able to contribute to and participate in the Chicago Architecture Biennial back in 2019. So I'm going to briefly talk to you all about our Public Memory and Memorials Lab before we turn it over to Dr. Nguyen, and then we'll have a conversation. So first and foremost, on the next slide, I would just like to reintroduce myself. As Marguerite said, my name is Jha D Williams, and I am a Senior Associate here at Mass Design Group, and I am also the co-director of our newly formed Public Memory and Memorial Lab. Outside of architecture, or parallel to architecture, I'm also a spoken word artist and community organizer here in the Boston area. And I like to make that acknowledgement because I feel like too often are we asked to kind of drop our intersectionality when we step into quote unquote professional spaces, when in fact for me, it is my experiences outside of architecture that really feed into and support the work that I'm able to do through this project work. And so I like to bring all the best parts of me, if you will, to the table as I explore this work. So briefly, I will introduce you all at a very high level to the ethos of Mass Design Group. We are a nonprofit design collective with offices here in the Boston area, which is where I am based. We also have a significantly large team in Kigali, Rwanda. We have teams in Poughkeepsie, New York, Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I'm sure I've probably left off a few of our smaller teams in other places. But as a nonprofit design collective, we believe that design is never neutral. It either hurts or heals. And therefore, our mission is to research, build, and advocate for architecture that promotes justice and human dignity. And so what we do is we help amplify the missions of other organizations through our work, which you'll hear me reference as I talk about some of our projects. We are a team of over 140 folks, right? So we're not just architects, but we are landscape architects, we are engineers, writers, researchers, film directors, and our team represents over 20 countries across the globe. And for me, at least, and I'm sure the whole team would agree with me when I say this, but that level of diversity has really impacted the ways in which we're able to approach our work and have expansive conversations about this mission-aligned and mission-driven work that we do. As we talk specifically about the lab, I think it's important to acknowledge that the world is a proliferation of symbols. These symbols themselves are never neutral, and they certainly either help or hurt us. And I think we all saw very clear examples of that more recently here over the last summer with the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, and generally just the responses to Confederate monuments being graffitied, projected on, defaced, destroyed, taken down, otherwise throughout the country. The other thing to consider is that the construction of public memory lends to itself this weight of particular narratives, bringing us to ask who or what is deemed important, whose voices are we hearing, but more importantly, who is being left out. And so part of what we're asking ourselves through this memorial work is, how is it that we are challenging the ways in which we as a society in the past have memorialized entities, people, individuals, history? What has our public spaces previously communicated to future generations that we want to be able to challenge in the work that we're doing? So the lab asks the question more generally, how can spatializing memory support healing and inspire collective action for generations to come? So if you go to the next slide, you all will be able to see what it is that I just read there. And so that is one of the ways in which we approach a lot of our memorial work. Again, questioning how is it that this notion of spatializing memory can create a collective call to action? How are we moving the needle forward in very critical conversations and topics and typologies in our current day built environments? And how are we signaling to a future generation that which was important to us now here today? So what I'll do now is I'll just walk you all through 4 projects that kind of exemplify this work that I've briefly described and starts to answer some of the questions that we internally are asking ourselves and our project partners. So first and foremost, I will reference the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama. And on this project, we work very closely with Brian Stevenson's team at the Equal Justice Initiative to conceive of both this project and the community engagement that led up to it. So a lot of times, if you hear us do a Mass Design Group lecture about this project, we reference 2 instances. One is the soil collection, and then the second is this project that you're seeing here on the screen. And I think it's important to reference the soil collection because as we were conceiving of the design project, we also realized that there needed to be a larger community engagement process by which the community, particularly the community across Alabama, needed to be brought into the process to raise awareness and also create a sense of buy-in. So through the soil collection process, we invited family members, descendants, students, community members of these various counties where lynchings had been recorded. We invited them to go to the sites of these lynchings or the approximate sites of these lynchings, collect the soil from those grounds and archive them in these glass jars. And so if you have a chance to visit the museum and the memorial, you will see these jars on display. For the memorial itself, we were working with Brian and his team to create the first memorial of its kind, one which acknowledges the racial terror of lynching in this country. EGI did research and was able to gather the names of over 4,400 individuals who had been lynched over a period of time here in the US. And it was very important to be able to mark that, to acknowledge that, to create a space in which we as a current day society are forced to grapple with this wrought history, but in doing so, come out with a sense of hope. What are we going to do about that? What does this mean? And how do we create enough conversation to prevent something like this happening again? And so outside of the pavilion, you can see in the left-hand side image, in the landscape, there's actually duplicate markers. And the expectations, as you consider this to be a living memorial, is that counties across the country will actually come claim their marker. And over time, the landscape memorial will become somewhat of a visual representation of who and where in this country is ready to have the conversations around reconciliation, who is ready to acknowledge the participation of their particular county government or city in this conversation around racial terror and lynching. On the next slide, there are photos of the Gun Violence Memorial Project, which is what I was referencing earlier when I said it feels good to be able to come back to the CAB community. So this is a project that we had an opportunity to exhibit during the 2019 Chicago Architecture Biennial. And it was actually at the opening for the National Memorial for Peace and Justice where we met Pam Bosley and Annette Nance-Holt, both who are co-founders of the organization there in Chicago, Purpose Over Pain, which they founded after both having had their sons taken due to gun violence on separate occasions for very different traumatic reasons. And they came together to form this organization to help other parents to heal and to reconcile and to be able to navigate this pain. And so it was at, as I said before, the opening for the National Memorial for Peace and Justice that we met them, and they essentially charged our team to say, what would it mean? What would it look like to create a memorial to honor victims of gun violence? How do we make space for that? What could a project like that look like? And so we started working almost immediately with one of our friends and partners, Hank Willis Thomas, whom we met there at the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. He has a statue in the landscape called Hands Up. And so we started to conceive of the project that you're seeing here on your screen. So in short, it is 4 glass houses. Each house is composed of 700 bricks. 700 is the number of Americans that are killed on a weekly basis due to gun violence in this country. And so for us, it was very important to consider how is it that we can represent both the infinite and the intimate? How do we acknowledge the individual personal lives and stories of these folks who have been taken due to gun violence, while also helping visitors to understand the enormity of the epidemic? How do we translate the statistics into humane stories? And so we invited family members of gun violence victims to contribute an object on behalf of their loved one. And we requested that the objects be representative of the individual's passions, interests, lifestyles, and etc. And then we encase those objects in individual bricks, and each brick is then labeled with the name as their family wants it represented, and the year of their birth and the year of their death. And we had collection events where we
gathered these objects. And it was during those events where we would take the time to ask the family to tell us more about their loved one, about the object, about why they were contributing to the memorial in the first place, why they thought a memorial would be helpful. And so we recorded these audios and these interviews. And so as you're walking through the houses, you actually are able to have a multi-sensory experience related to these individuals who are being honored. So after we left the biennial, we took a year off, thank you, COVID, and are now actually exhibiting the houses at the National Building Museum in Washington, DC. And it is our hope eventually to be able to exhibit 52 houses across the country, 52 representing both the number of states and territories here in the US, but also representing the number of weeks in a year as it relates, again, to these alarming statistics that this epidemic is currently holding our country in. The next project I want to talk to you all about is actually here in Boston and gives me much pride as a native Bostonian. I can certainly say that there are very few instances where the contributions of Black people or Black Americans are represented in public spaces, let alone the contributions of Black women. So the opportunity to be a part of a project that honors both Coretta Scott and Martin Luther King Jr. here in my home city has certainly been an honor that I could not have anticipated. So this is the design competition, an international design competition that we entered with Hank Willis Thomas. We were one of 5 finalists and ultimately moved forward to be able to work on this project with the organization called King Boston. And it was very important for Hank early on in our design charrettes. He made it very clear that he wanted to be able to represent love in public spaces. How do we bring more love to a public space? How do we center that in our conversations as we talk about, calls to action, moving forward? How do we center Boston? How do we center love in Boston in this public space? And so the site for this project is the historic Boston Common, which is one of the oldest and largest public spaces in the city and in the country as a whole. And it is sited, well, you all, maybe you know Boston, but it's in the center of the Common. And you can see here in these images that it's actually an abstraction of a moment between Coretta Scott and Martin Luther King Jr. So there's a photograph that Hank referenced in his work where it appears to Hank, as he said, that Coretta's actually holding Martin up. And so he took that photo and abstracted it. And for us as a whole team, it was very important to use this moment to represent the couple as fierce lovers, right? As individuals whose work through the civil rights movement was actually very closely influenced by community and by an embrace, quite honestly, rather than going with what one would consider traditional representations of figures where you have a full statue and a full body and it's very statuesque. We wanted instead to represent an action, and that being the embrace. Also supporting this particular sculpture, you can see in the left-hand image, is a plaza, and that is actually the 1965 Memorial Plaza, which honors and acknowledges the 1955 Freedom March that took place here in Boston. And so over 20,000 activists and community organizers and leaders marched with MLK from Roxbury to the Boston Common, a little off to the side, you can't see it here in this image, but to the Parkman Bandstand. And so we also wanted to create space to acknowledge those names in that moment in time. The last project I will share with you all is a continuation of this theme for me personally, the importance of being able to acknowledge and celebrate the contributions of Black women in public spaces. Less than 2% of our memorials and monuments in this country honor Black women specifically, and I think that statistic might actually be even lower than I just quoted it, so I'm being generous. But this particular project is the Kendall School Division II Memorial, and I'm sure the next time you all hear from me, the name will have changed because the team is in the process of conceiving of a list of names to choose from. But here we are honoring the contributions and the work of a woman named Louise B. Miller, who in 1952 sued Gallaudet University for their discrimination and segregation policies so that her son, Kenneth B. Miller, would be able to attend the school there in Washington, DC, rather than having to go all the way to Philadelphia. And so at the time, Gallaudet and still remains one of the only universities dedicated to the education of deaf and hard of hearing students. And so Mrs. Miller, as I said before, filed a lawsuit against the school and ultimately won. And so in this memorial project, we are acknowledging her contributions as well as honoring the first 23 Black students that were admitted to Gallaudet University in the 1950s. And so we've been working very closely with both the Miller family, well, not just both, but with the Miller family, the current Black student population, the alumni student population, as well as the broader DC community, to gather feedback and input as to how this particular memorial will both honor the work of the Millers while also contributing to the larger conversation about civil rights in the DC area and the contributions of Black Americans in this country. So with that, I will pause and pass it over to my co-panelists for today prior to us getting into a broader conversation. Thank you all.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jha D. It's such a pleasure to listen to you talk about this work in such depth and breadth. I loved the way that you opened and talked about what it means to position yourself and, bringing in an intersectional approach to what it means to do this work, what it means to do design, think about spatial justice in these capacities. I am one of the co-designers for the Chicago Torture Justice Memorial Project, along with architect John Lee. We can advance the slide. So I'll be speaking more specifically about the Chicago Torture Justice Memorial Project. And for folks who are, before I start, I wanted to thank Marguerite, the Chicago Architecture Biennial, and Tess for this invitation and opportunity to talk more about the Chicago Torture Justice Memorial Project and to be alongside Jha D in this panel. So actually on May 6th was the 6th anniversary of when the reparations ordinance passed in Chicago. And it's really interesting that not a lot of people actually know that the reparations ordinance in Chicago is actually the first in the country that addresses police violence and honors survivors of police torture. And it was made possible from decades of intergenerational and interracial organizing efforts that were led by the Memorial Project itself, Project Mia, which was started by Miriam Kaba, We Charge Genocide, Amnesty International USA, and the Black Lives Matter movement during the 2014-2015 election season. And part of this ordinance included multiple things. Could you advance the slide? And then the next one. It included education on police torture in public schools. So for 8th graders and for 10th graders, a formal apology from the Chicago City Council, free college education for survivors and their families, financial compensation, a center, which I'll put the link in the chat a little bit later, but a counseling center that centers politicized healing for survivors. And then actually the last piece of this reparations ordinance that has yet to see the light of day is the Memorial Project. But just a little bit of background is that this case was a result of John Burge, who rose to the ranks of Chicago police commander after having trained through the CIA Project Phoenix to torture and assassinate people in Vietnam, and then use those torture and assassination techniques in Chicago to force confessions from over 120 predominantly Black men. And so this project, the way that I've been thinking about it is thinking about the relationship between the military and industrial complex and the prison industrial complex. And just thinking about what is the work of a memorial and what are the limitations of reparations and what it can actually offer. What are the limitations of what the law can actually provide for? How do you account for loss? How do you account for the heartache and the pain? And what does it mean to truly honor and mourn the death of folks that have been incarcerated, but people who continue to stay locked up, and then those who survive who have to um, recreate a whole new life. How do you create a space that can encapsulate both the mourning and the continued fight for justice? And so, can you advance the slide? So then John and I thought of this memorial project. Oh, is my sound getting fainter? Thank you for letting me know. I think I'm a little far from my computer. At any point, if my volume is a little low, please feel free to write it in the chat. But John and I were thinking about what it means to design this memorial. And part of thinking through designing this memorial was actually basing it off of the decades of organizing the decades of organizing that happened, and just thinking about like, what does it truly mean to honor survivors of police torture? What does it mean to tell this history? And so we were thinking about the name of the memorial. We were thinking about conceptualizing the design of it, and also basing it off of a survivor-led, community-based process that the Chicago Torture Justice Memorial Project had invested so much time in already, and we continue to in so many ways. And they conducted oral histories, interviews, community input processes with survivors, community members, activists, local artists. And part of what came about that conversation resulted in what, them sharing what they want, survivors sharing what they wanted, which included 100% of the survivors wanted their names on the memorial. So for us as memorial designers, we wanted to really honor that. And that was for us a non-negotiable. What does it mean to name, right? And then they wanted a place for contemplation, a place to really gather and think about how this history is transmitted to the next generation. Part of this reparations ordinance includes public school curriculum. So we were thinking about how can this be a public school, a public field trip site, right? And so part of that influenced the way that we were thinking about what it means to create this memorial. And so we decided on naming it Breath, Form, and Freedom, and thinking about breath in so many ways, right? And thinking about the forms of police torture that results in the taking away of breath, but also thinking about anti-colonial theorist Frantz Fanon and his discussion of combat breathing. What does it mean to breathe under conditions of colonial duress? What does it mean to push back, to fight for life? And Anthony Holmes, one of the first survivors to come forward, talks about what it means to still be here, right? To be able to share these histories, to be able to continue to fight for justice for those who are still locked up inside, for those whose stories have yet to come forward, for those who are still surviving in different ways. And so we were thinking about how do you kind of encapsulate breath into the design of this, right? And so we were thinking about passageways, we were thinking about the kind of place for contemplation, for people to gather and co-breathe together in different ways. And so there are 4 elements to the memorial. The first is the names, and if you can advance the slide, hopefully they might be a little bit out of order because my thoughts are also kind of coming together. But we were thinking about it as a spiral, kind of thinking about it in terms of other protest movements and how that inspires our design, thinking about the Zapatistas and the Garagole, the shape of the snail, and what it means to build a community of protection in that way, thinking about Standing Rock and the protests that happened there where Indigenous elders were in the middle, and then younger Indigenous folks on the outside of that, folks of color, white people, just thinking about one's own positionality in relationship to state violence. And our own body's precarity in relationship to that. And so just thinking about what it means to create it through the shape. And so there are two ways that you can enter, but the first way is first seeing the names and then seeing actually the timeline. And we were thinking about how, there's a way that timelines can just end at a particular moment, but we wanted the timeline to actually fold into the community space to show that like time continues to unfold as state violence is still very present and real, especially police violence in the city of Chicago. So what does it mean to have this space be a place where people can gather, protest, learn, and build and commune together? And so we're still working on the timeline, and so that's why it's a little blank in the rendering. But we're hoping that it folds into the middle space, and the middle space could be a place where it could be like a cookout, a teach-in, an art gallery. It's kind of modular in terms of like how you could set it up and take it down. And then we're also working to the fourth element is thinking about the survivors and working with them to write manifestos, where it's thinking about the writing process as reparative because they were forced to confess. So what does it mean for them to write into the future, write their hopes and dreams for the next generation? And so, and then I think if you can advance the next slide. So here's some of the view. We're still working with the city. We have yet to secure land and we have yet to secure funding. So we're still waiting on that. But there's actually a month-long series of celebration and events that are being co-hosted by the Chicago Torture Justice Center and the Chicago Torture Justice Memorial Project. And I think I'll just end there and open it up to our conversation and Q&A. And this is the aerial view. And and this is for folks who want to learn more about the cases and the individual survivors. The Invisible Institute put together a really amazing archive. And then I'll drop the link in for the series of celebration. Great, thank you.
Oh, okay, there we go. I was steady trying to click unmute and it just was not working for me. You would think after 18 months of being on Zoom, we would have this all figured out. But yeah, so I thank you as well, Patricia, for such an interesting presentation. I was anxious to know more about that, and thank you for taking the time to really kind of explain that. Of course, at a high level, you can't walk us through all the design decisions, but I thank you for taking the time. I think one thing, I know, there's a million things we really wanted to talk about here, but one thing I would like to go back to and just hear you talk a little bit more about is the decision for everyone's name to be represented, because for me, when you said that, of course, it struck a number of chords, but it also kind of just goes back to this conversation that I was having about, representing both the infinite and the intimate, and what does it mean to list everyone's name, and what were some of the decisions that were made behind that, if you could expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question. Because we were thinking about what does it mean to be very literal in some ways, right? And thinking about like what happens, how do we think about design and, spatial practices, and thinking through like, for lack of a better word, like things that are didactic versus the abstract, right? And I love the way that you put it. I think this is actually much more beautiful, the way that you the infinite and the intimate. And for this project, I was deeply inspired by a lot of like Black radical thinkers, Buddhism, and just thinking about the hashtag Say Her Name and thinking about what it means for Black women to actually be named, with the violence that happens, with police violence, state violence, and thinking about the importance of like what naming means for survivors and how for them it is one of the first points of what it means to have a memorial, to be recognized, to be seen, to be held in this capacity, especially because statistics can really abstract people in some way. But it's also, I'm thinking about Saidiya Hartman's work and like her discussion of the violence of abstraction, but also Turquoise Dyson's work, visual artist Turquoise Dyson, and her work with abstraction, which kind of like takes abstraction in a different way, that opens up avenues and opportunities to enter these histories through different sensorial relationships, as you talked about before. Oh no, is it still hard to hear me?
You're going in and out. At some points it's very clear, and then sometimes it gets a little bit lower and then it comes back up. Yeah.
I'm gonna try to, I wonder if it's because I'm too high. Is this better?
That is, yes.
Oh, okay, great. But yeah, I hope that answers the question in some way. If we were thinking about the form itself as being the abstraction, it's like the naming and the timeline itself as being very like, here's the history, here are the people, here's what happened, but the form itself as kind of embodying layers of abstraction that allows for different entry points into these histories.
Got it. Thank you for sharing that.
Thanks. I was thinking through what you said about centering love and like what it means to do that in a community space. And so I'd love to hear more about how this is activated through the space itself and with community partners or with the different kind of programming that you do, and how this place is the sculpture is enlivened.
Sure. I think, of course, we have to accept that after these memorials, these moments, these designs are implemented and they live on a site, of course, the general public, the community, they're going to do what they're going to do with it, right? We can have aspirations and hopes and dreams and instructions and narratives, and ultimately when it lands, what is going to happen is what is going to happen. However, our intention behind it and in being unafraid to represent love in a public space and being very clear about that, the desire is that others will feel comfortable representing love in this space. And I wish that I had a photo of it. I'm sure I do somewhere, but during our interview for the project, Michael Murphy, one of our founders of our firm, and Hank Willis Thomas actually hugged. They embraced one another. And they were, because the point was that like, the expectation is that folks will be able to come to this monument, to this memorial, to this plaza, read the information, digest all that took place, well, not all that took place, but get a high level understanding of exactly what happened here, reflect on it, and then feel comfortable embracing either the person that they arrived with or perhaps a stranger or what have you. And in the reflective polished bronze, see themselves reflected in that moment in history, right? And then added to that, of course, I heard you ask the question about programming. I think we are, throughout all of our projects that we're working on, we understand that, as I said before, it is one thing to design the moment, the object, the architecture, the experience. It is another thing to be able to identify who is going to be the steward of that experience. And so we work very closely with project partners with the hope that, either they will continue moving the project forward, or they will be able to identify other folks, or we can help collaborate with that. And so King Boston, in this instance, is the entity, is the organization that initiated the competition. And so they are, if you are not already following King Boston or aren't aware of the work that they're doing, but they are already dedicated to seasons upon seasons of programming related to civil rights, social justice, acknowledging Black culture and the cultures of Black and brown bodies in the Boston area, around, yes, this memorial, but also culturally significant sites throughout Boston, right? And so I think they will be able to maintain this mission of this particular memorial and the ethos of what it was that we were trying to capture through their programming, one-off programming, but then also the annual programming that acknowledges the various anniversaries of MLK and Coretta Scott and the 1965 Freedom March and so forth. And so I think those are some of the ways. And then of course, you also add to it other organizations here in the Boston area that will program the space and know that the signal was sent to them for them to be invited to contribute to the programming of the space as well. So thinking about how the local artists, the poets, the dancers, the young artists, et cetera, will come here and know that this was designed for you. This was meant for you. This was meant to honor your legacy and speak to your future. So those are some of the thoughts there.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
I love that so much because I've been thinking about, or part of what we were conceptualizing for this memorial was Doris Salcedo, a Colombian artist, and her thoughts around what it means to create a monumental anti-monument. And this idea of like what it means to actually continuously activate these spaces. Right? There was part of, for us thinking through this design was how do we make sure that just because it's built doesn't mean that history is resolved, right? But it's this ongoing process, this ongoing dialogue that continues to hold. And so I love hearing the way that you're talking about how these community partners, local artists, poets, musicians are able to kind of like integrate into the space and enliven, the built environment in some way that is seen as inanimate, but actually animates it.
Yes.
I really appreciate that.
I know we are getting close to question and answer, so I don't know if we want to pause for a moment and give Marguerite an option or a moment to step in here so we can answer some of the questions that I'm sure folks must have.
Yes, thank you. I was just about to kind of jump in here with you all. We do have a couple of questions so far, and then I had some questions. Thank you so much for this very engaging dialogue, and it was so great to hear more about the projects that you're working on and kind of memorializing justice. It's it's a deep topic that we're talking about, but it's really interesting to learn more. I have one question that's come through that says, how does spatial justice and healing generational trauma kind of connect when it comes to building these or kind of designing these memorials? This is coming from someone with a clinical perspective and understands that there can be a lot of healing from kind of connecting those two.
I don't know, I can go first or, okay, sure. So, there's so many different ways to answer this question. I'll give a very specific example and then I'll try to quickly broaden it and then I'll make space for Dr. Nguyen as well. But for example, so as we were doing the object collection for the Gun Violence Memorial Project, as I mentioned before, we invited families to come to these collection events and bring us the objects that they chose to represent their loved one. And oftentimes families would come together, right? So it wouldn't just be an individual, it would be 2 or 3 folks that were coming probably en route to somewhere else and stopping with us for a moment to bring the object. And I cannot tell you all how many times there was a conversation taking place for the first time within that family by them sitting across from the table from us. It was evident to us that something that the mother or the sibling or the so-and-so had not yet previously expressed, And it was being expressed for the first time in the room with us as they were talking about their loved one, as they were talking about that particular object, or referencing, you know, this was the first time that they might have stepped into that person's room or removed something from that person's room. And so when we talk about healing generational trauma, my point that I'm getting to is that the spatial justice, you know, the spatializing memory, in some instances for us, creates simply the space for the conversation, right? It creates the opportunity for the dialogue, the challenge to say the things that maybe have not been said, the prompt to ask the questions that maybe have not been asked, and at a minimum, the opportunity to reflect on something that you otherwise might not have been able to reflect on. And so it gives you the opportunity to have a slightly different perspective and, you know, maybe go challenge your grandmother on her thought about something, or your father on his thought about something, based off of what it is that you've been able to physically experience in a space with others. And so I think that's one of the ways that the two can connect, for sure.
Yeah, I put two links in. The first one was for the anniversary celebrations, but the second one is thinking through politicized grief. And the Chicago Torture Justice Center is just an amazing place, amazing resource hub, amazing center that's co-led by Cindy and Aislinn, but so many of the survivors who have recently been released, have been released for a while, continue to support each other in the process of mourning, in the process of reintegrating, in the process of fortifying their own livelihood. And it's really interesting in thinking about politicized grief, politicized healing, somatics in the body, and thinking about that in relationship to generational violence, right, or harm caused by the state, caused by histories of colonization, of slavery, of war, right? And what does it mean to actually have a space, as Jha D was talking about, to dialogue, to commune together, to love, to encounter one another, to like challenge each other in different ways, that kind of actually opens up ways of connecting that I think, you know, the pandemic has revealed even more so to us, the power of what it, you know, when like the importance of actually connecting to each other and building community in these capacities, and what it means to have these monuments and these memorials as spaces of encounter, as spaces where generational dialogue can take place. And for the Chicago Torture Justice Memorial Project in particular, thinking about like, what does it mean for this to be a field trip site? What does it mean for younger generations? And for me, I'm thinking about Black and Brown Chicago public school students, as someone who also grew up in Chicago public schools myself. What does it mean for them to learn from survivors themselves? A different place of encountering history, a different place of understanding the fight for justice, and like the power of telling your own story and history making, right? Yeah. So just echoing what Jha D was talking about.
Yeah, I think it definitely goes back to what Jha D had mentioned before at the beginning, the intimate, and that having these spaces for, you know, generational dialogue, and these also these intimate conversations that maybe you haven't spoken to someone else about before, and then kind of bringing it to a wider audience that then sees these monuments. It's kind of creating intimate moments, but more public. We also had a question about kind of memorializing and thinking about how these memorials are, how we're thinking about the future and generations in this context of like, how do you approach when you're designing these spaces, thinking about the future, not just the past, but how the future generations can really come there to commemorate or understand or have a place to grieve or just to be.
I went first last time, so I'll let you go. Yeah, please jump in there.
So the way that we were thinking about like the spiral and where it ends and how the timeline actually unfolds into the community space itself, it's to kind of say that it kind of spatially and symbolically represent how time continues to unfold and the past is always present with us. And so in thinking about a future orientation to what it means to continue to fight for justice is thinking about what does it mean to also remember history and remember the past, remember intergenerational, interracial struggles for justice, and how that actually grounds us as we fight for the future, as we fight to live more livable lives, right? In many ways that isn't impacted constantly by the threat of police torture, by the threat of incarceration, by the threat of like everyday warfare that happens in under-resourced and divested Black and Brown communities. And so for us, we thought about time in that way in terms of thinking about how the space can constantly be activated in these ways that unfold and connect to the present moment, where community activists, organizers, and artists can take it up as part of how they're responding to the contemporary moment and envision the future simultaneously.
Marguerite, do you mind just repeating the question for me? Because I want to make sure that I understood it before I offer the answer that I think I have.
Yeah, of course. So how do we memorialize a person or event while thinking about future generations or contexts, kind of?
Yeah, perfect. Okay, thank you. I think for the work that we do, there's constantly this lens of a participatory and living memorial, right? And what are the layers in which we are folding into whatever this current contextual memorial is? How are we layering in the opportunity for future generations, whether that's tomorrow or years from now, to be able to see themselves reflected in the work that we're doing? So as I mentioned with, the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, for example, the duplicate markers are future forward. They are looking forward. They are meant to be participatory and an opportunity for this country to have an active conversation about healing from this racial terror, if you will. And so, as I mentioned before, the number, as we start to see markers being claimed from the site and relocated to the counties where the lynchings took place, that is an opportunity to have conversations with future generations, because we don't anticipate that all X number of markers are going to be removed in 1 year, right? This is going to take time. This is going to be multiple generations, constituents, leaders in these various counties that are going to have to initiate these conversations. And so we don't know exactly what that looks like, but we know it at least looks like a conversation. Some of the other work, even the memorial at Gallaudet University, less obvious of a participatory moment, but throughout the memorial, and I wish that I had more time to share with you all so many more graphics related to that particular project, but there's actually a timeline through which folks walk, and along that timeline, the Freedom Garden, as we call it, are rooms, small outdoor classrooms that are all kind of driven by deaf design principles, where we anticipate that over time, over generations, classes, generations of students will be able to come activate the spaces in the ways that they see fit. So in the conversations that we've been having with our stakeholders, we've asked questions like, what does it mean to design a Black deaf-centric space? What is that? What is that to you? What does that mean to you? And how do we create a space in which future generations of Black deaf students will arrive on this campus and know that this space is for them. This space was created for them to express themselves, to be themselves, to develop, to grow. And so we are folding in those responses to those questions, to the materiality, to the orientation, to the design of the space, in an attempt to constantly be considerate of the future generations that will be inspired by, hopefully, these memorial projects. So it varies from project to project, but it's possible, we think. We believe, rather, not we think, we believe.
That's great. I think that's a perfect place for us to kind of end. I know there could be so many more questions and a lot more to kind of dig into this conversation, but I just want to say thank you to you both for being here with us today and sharing a lot about what you're doing or working on the ground. And a lot of appreciation to our audience members for giving some of these questions. And thank you so much. And we really appreciate it. And we look forward to welcoming everyone back for our next program next month. And so more information on programs at the Chicago Architecture Biennial are on our website, and we will see you very soon. Have a great evening.
Thank you. You do the same. Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.